In this episode, we're going to focus on a skill that sounds simple but quietly drives a huge percentage of real-world governance and compliance failures: defining what the system actually is. The Certified in Governance, Risk, and Compliance (CGRC) mindset depends on being able to draw a clear boundary around a system, name the assets inside that boundary, and understand what connects to it, because you cannot protect, assess, or prove compliance for something you cannot describe. Beginners often assume a system is just an application or a server, but in governance terms, a system is a set of components, people, processes, and data flows that work together for a purpose. Hidden scope happens when parts of that reality are left out of the description, like a third-party integration, a shared identity service, a reporting database, or a manual process that handles sensitive data outside the main tool. Hidden scope creates hidden risk because controls may not cover the missing parts, and it creates compliance surprises because auditors and assessors ask questions that your documentation cannot answer. Our goal is to make boundary thinking feel natural, so you can prevent the most common kind of surprise, which is discovering after the fact that you were responsible for more than you realized. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.News in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To define a system well, you need to understand what assets are, because assets are the things you are trying to protect and manage. An asset is anything that has value to the organization and could be harmed, misused, or lost, such as information, software, hardware, services, people's time, or even trust. In security and compliance work, the most common assets are data, systems that process data, and services that enable operations. Beginners sometimes think assets are only physical things, like laptops and servers, but a dataset can be an asset, a business process can be an asset, and an identity service can be an asset because it controls access to everything else. Asset identification matters because risk assessment depends on knowing what is at stake, and control selection depends on knowing what needs protection. If you don't name an asset, it tends to be treated casually, which often means it is underprotected and undermonitored. Asset definition also supports accountability because you can assign owners to assets, which makes it possible to maintain controls over time. When assets are clearly identified, governance becomes more concrete because decisions have clear targets rather than vague intentions. System boundaries are the lines you draw to say what is inside the system and what is outside it, and those lines are not just technical. Boundaries can include physical boundaries, like a data center or office, logical boundaries, like network segments and identity domains, and organizational boundaries, like what is controlled by your organization versus a vendor. A boundary definition answers what components, processes, and data flows are part of the system you are assessing and governing. Beginners often assume the boundary is obvious because they think of the system as the main application, but real systems rely on shared services like authentication, logging, databases, and external APIs that are part of the system's security reality. If your boundary excludes a critical dependency, your controls may not cover it, and you may fail to meet requirements without realizing it. Boundary definition also prevents overreach, because it keeps you from claiming responsibility for things you do not control or from applying requirements to unrelated systems. A mature CGRC program uses boundaries to make scope clear, so everyone understands what is being assessed and what evidence is expected. Clear boundaries make governance defensible because they explain why certain controls apply and where accountability begins and ends. Hidden scope often starts with interconnections because systems rarely operate alone. Interconnections include data feeds, integrations with third-party services, connections to shared infrastructure, and dependencies on enterprise services like identity and monitoring. Each interconnection can bring new risks, such as data exposure, trust assumptions, and reliance on external uptime. Beginners sometimes treat interconnections as technical trivia, but in compliance terms they are often critical because they can change what requirements apply. For example, if a system sends regulated personal data to a vendor, then vendor management and data sharing controls become part of your scope. If a system depends on a shared identity service, then access control assurance is only as strong as that identity services configuration and governance. Interconnections also create pathways for lateral movement and cascading failure, which means your risk is not limited to your own code. A mature boundary definition explicitly lists key interconnections and describes what kind of data and trust relationship exists at each one. This reduces surprises because it turns invisible dependencies into documented responsibilities. Another major source of hidden scope is data, because data often travels into places that weren't considered part of the system when it was first described. Data might be exported into reporting tools, copied into spreadsheets, attached to tickets, or stored in backups and archives that are managed by different teams. Each of those locations becomes part of the system's risk reality because the data is still the same sensitive data, even if it is now in a different container. Beginners sometimes assume that if the primary system is secure, then the data is secure, but data copies can defeat that assumption quickly. A boundary definition that ignores where data flows will miss major control needs, like how exports are controlled, how reports are accessed, and how retention and disposal are enforced. A mature approach treats the system boundary as including the places where the system's data is created, processed, stored, and shared, even when those places are not part of the main application. This is where governance and privacy connect strongly, because privacy obligations often apply to data wherever it goes, not just in the original system. When you track data flows as part of boundary definition, you prevent the most common compliance shock, which is discovering personal data was sitting somewhere unmanaged. Defining boundaries also requires clarity about what is managed internally and what is managed externally, because responsibility changes when vendors are involved. If a third party hosts a service, processes your data, or provides a key component of your system's functionality, that vendor becomes part of your system's risk and compliance story. Beginners often think vendor involvement means the vendor is responsible for everything, but in governance terms, responsibility is shared. Your organization remains responsible for selecting the vendor appropriately, defining requirements contractually, monitoring performance, and ensuring the vendor's controls meet your obligations. Boundary definition should include what parts are under vendor control, what parts remain under your control, and what evidence you expect for assurance. This is important because an assessor may ask how you know the vendor is meeting requirements. And if your boundary definition is vague, you will not have a clear answer. A mature CGRC program treats vendor boundaries as explicit, not implied, which reduces overconfidence. It also helps teams understand where they must implement compensating controls, such as additional monitoring or access restrictions. When vendor boundaries are clear, hidden scope becomes far less likely. Another concept that strengthens boundary definition is identifying trust boundaries, which are the places where assumptions about identity, authorization, or data integrity change. Trust boundaries can occur when data crosses from one network zone to another, when it moves from your system to a third party, or when it moves from a controlled environment into a user's device. At trust boundaries, controls often need to be stronger because you are leaving one zone of assurance and entering another. Beginners sometimes think trust is binary, like either you trust a system or you don't, but in governance work, trust is contextual. You may trust a vendor's platform for certain functions, but still require controls around how your data is accessed and logged. You may trust internal users in general, but still require least privilege and monitoring because mistakes and misuse happen. Trust boundaries help you identify where access control, encryption, validation, and monitoring become most important. They also help you decide where to place evidence collection so you can demonstrate how you control risk at the points where risk changes. When you map trust boundaries, you often discover hidden scope because you notice data crossing points you didn't previously consider. Asset and boundary definition also needs to include people and processes because systems do not operate without human involvement. Manual steps like approving access, processing requests, handling exceptions, and generating reports can be part of the system's security and privacy behavior. If a compliance requirement depends on a manual review, that review process is part of scope, and it must be defined, owned, and evidenced. Beginners sometimes think the system description should only include technology, but assessments often ask about how people interact with the system and how decisions are governed. A manual process can introduce risk through errors, inconsistent handling, or unauthorized access to exported data. Boundary definition should therefore include key roles like system owners, data owners, administrators, and users, and it should describe how they interact with the system. It should also include critical processes like onboarding, offboarding, change approval, incident handling, and retention enforcement. This is not about making a giant organizational chart. It is about acknowledging the human components that affect control effectiveness. When people and processes are included, the boundary reflects reality rather than a simplified fiction. One practical reason boundary definition matters is that controls are selected and evaluated based on what is in scope. If you miss an asset, you will likely miss the controls that protect it. If you miss an interconnection, you will miss the controls that manage data sharing and trust assumptions. If you misplace a boundary, you might apply controls where they are not needed and miss them where they are critical, which wastes resources and leaves gaps. In compliance work, assessors often test whether your scope makes sense by asking about dependencies and data flows, because those are the places where organizations commonly hide risk unintentionally. A mature boundary definition helps you respond clearly, because you can show that you recognize the dependencies and handled them intentionally. It also helps internally because teams can coordinate more effectively when they share the same understanding of scope. Without a shared scope, different teams will assume different responsibilities, and gaps will form between them. Boundary definition is therefore a governance tool for coordination as much as it is a documentation tool. Boundary definition also supports change management, because systems evolve, and scope can quietly expand without anyone noticing. New features may introduce new data types, new integrations may create new interconnections, and vendor changes may shift responsibility boundaries. If your system boundary description is static, it becomes wrong over time, which creates hidden scope again. A mature program treats boundary definition as something that must be reviewed periodically and updated when major changes occur. This review should be tied to governance processes, such as change approval, architecture review, and risk assessment updates. Beginners sometimes think documentation is a one-time task, but in governance, documentation is evidence of ongoing control, and stale documentation is evidence of drift. Boundary updates also protect privacy because new data flows can create new obligations, and if those obligations are not recognized early, the organization may violate expectations without realizing it. A living boundary description allows the program to stay aligned with reality. That alignment is what prevents the surprise of discovering a system is larger and riskier than documented. Another important benefit is that clear boundaries improve communication with stakeholders, especially when security and compliance requirements feel burdensome. When you can describe the system precisely, you can explain why certain controls are required and why certain evidence is expected. This reduces resistance because people can see the relationship between the system's assets, the risks, and the controls. It also helps leadership make better decisions about resource allocation because they can see what is truly in scope and what must be protected. Beginners often struggle to talk about scope without sounding vague, but a boundary definition provides language you can reuse. It also helps when incidents occur because responders need to know what systems and data are involved, what connections exist, and what logs and evidence sources are available. Clear boundaries make incident response faster and more accurate, which reduces impact. In CGRC terms, this is a great example of governance work producing operational benefit, not just compliance paperwork. As we close, defining system assets and boundaries is about making responsibility visible, preventing hidden scope, and turning risk management into something you can actually execute. Assets are what you value and must protect, and boundaries define what is included in the system you are governing and assessing. Hidden scope usually appears through interconnections, data flows, vendor dependencies, trust boundaries, and human processes that handle sensitive information outside the core application. When those elements are documented and understood, controls can be selected appropriately, evidence can be planned, and compliance discussions become predictable instead of surprising. A mature program treats boundary definitions as living descriptions that evolve with change, because systems are never truly static. This mindset also supports integrity because it prevents the organization from claiming protection and compliance for a simplified version of reality. If you can define what the system is, what it touches, and where responsibility changes hands, you have solved one of the hardest problems in governance. You have made scope real. That is a foundational CGRC skill, and it is one of the best ways to prevent surprises that become incidents, audit findings, and trust failures.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.